In a shocking turn of events, last night's episode of The Late Show imploded when Representative Jasmine Crockett refused to play the polite political guest, instead turning the tables on Stephen Colbert with a ferocity that left the studio audience stunned and production scrambling to maintain control of an interview spiraling rapidly into uncharted territory. The tension in Studio 50 at the Ed Sullivan Theater was palpable. Before Representative Jasmine Crockett even walked onto the stage, staff whispered about her reputation for not pulling punches, but production assumed the congresswoman would follow the usual political playbook: measured responses, rehearsed talking points, and polite laughter at Colbert's jokes. They couldn't have been more wrong. The interview began innocuously enough. Colbert's introduction was standard fare, highlighting Crockett's rising profile in Congress and her background as a civil rights attorney before transitioning to his signature blend of political commentary disguised as comedy. So, Representative Crockett, you've made quite a splash in Washington. Some might say you're making waves, while others might say you're just making noise, Colbert quipped, his audience responding with their customary appreciative laughter. Crockett smiled thinly, already showing signs that this wouldn't be the typical political guest spot. Interesting framing, Stephen. I notice how you immediately diminish the work of one of the few black women in Congress as potentially just making noise. Was that intentional or just a reflexive habit? The audience's reaction was mixed. Uncomfortable chuckles mingled with scattered applause. Colbert, momentarily caught off guard, recovered with a practiced pivot. Well, I'm just repeating what some critics have said. I personally think all voices in Congress should be heard, especially those representing communities that have historically been marginalized. Do you? Crockett leaned forward. Because sometimes it seems like this show is more interested in landing jokes than engaging with the actual issues affecting those communities. The cameraman caught Colbert's eyebrow rising slightly as he adjusted his position. The production team began shifting nervously in the control room, recognizing the telltale signs of an interview veering off script. We try to use humor to make difficult topics more accessible, Colbert defended. But let's talk about your recent comments on voter suppression legislation. You've called it, and I quote, Jim Crow in a three-piece suit. That's pretty strong language. It's accurate language, Crockett replied. But I notice you're quick to question my rhetoric while your monologues get to be as hyperbolic as you want. Double standard much? The audience was now completely split, half enjoying the unexpected authenticity, half uncomfortable with the deviation from the show's usual rhythm. A producer's voice crackled in Colbert's earpiece, likely suggesting a pivot to safer territory. Colbert cleared his throat. Let's talk about your proposed economic policies. You've advocated for what critics call radical redistribution. Your response? Something in Crockett's expression hardened. You know what I find interesting, Stephen? How the wealthy media class always frames economic justice as radical. Tell me, how much are you paid per episode to make jokes about policies that would help working Americans? The audience gasped. Colbert's smile tightened as he leaned back, in his chair, visibly recalibrating his approach. I think we've struck a nerve, he said, attempting to regain control through humor. Maybe we should pivot to something less contentious. Your fashion choices have gotten attention. Really? Crockett interrupted. We're discussing critical legislation affecting millions of Americans, and you want to talk about my clothes? This is exactly the problem with political coverage. Sensing the interview slipping further from his grasp, Colbert took a more direct approach. Representative, with all due respect, you seem to have come in with quite a chip on your shoulder tonight. With all due respect, Stephen, I came in expecting a substantive conversation, not to be the punchline for your predominantly white audience. The control room erupted in panic. This was unprecedented territory for The Late Show. Colbert, sensing disaster, attempted to deploy his most reliable weapon, mockery cloaked in satire. Well, Congresswoman, perhaps if your policy positions weren't so easy to satirize, we wouldn't need to joke about them. I mean, your stance on corporate regulation reads like it was written by someone who's never actually run a business. Crockett's eyes narrowed. And your jokes sound like they were written by someone who's never had to worry about paying rent. The audience noise grew more polarized, some cheering Crockett's directness, others stunned by the breakdown of the usual talk show decorum. You know, Colbert continued, his tone sharpening, your economic proposals remind me of a child's wish list for Santa. I want free college, and free health care, and free housing. The only thing missing is a pony. The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Crockett leaned forward, her voice dangerously calm. That's interesting coming from someone who makes millions mocking politicians while offering zero solutions. Yourself. Tell me, Stephen, is punching down at progressive policies your idea of speaking truth to power? Or is it just what your corporate overlords at Paramount pay you to do? A producer frantically signaled for a commercial break, but Colbert waved them off, determined not to appear rattled. Speaking of corporate overlords, he fired back, your voting record shows a curious reluctance to challenge certain big donors in your district. Principled stand or practical politics? You really want to talk about principles? Crockett asked, her voice rising. Let's discuss how you've built a brand on supposedly speaking truth to power. But when real power sits across from you, you lob softballs and jokes. Where was this tough questioning when you had CEOs and war criminals on your show? The audience was now completely divided, with audible arguments breaking out in some sections. Backstage, producers were frantically discussing whether to forcibly cut to commercial. But before they could decide, Colbert made a critical mistake. Perhaps, he said with thinly veiled condescension, your approach to governance is why so many of your initiatives fail to gain traction, even within your own party. Righteous indignation plays well on Twitter, but legislation requires more than moral posturing. Something changed in Crockett's demeanor. The defensive congresswoman vanished, replaced by the formidable attorney who had never lost a civil rights case. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right. Let's talk about effectiveness and moral posturing. In fact, I brought some interesting data about your show that I think your audience might find fascinating. Colbert's practiced smile faltered slightly as Crockett reached into her jacket pocket. The production team froze, unprepared for a guest who had brought props without prior clearance. The audience, sensing the shift in power dynamics, fell into a hushed silence. What exactly are you doing, Representative? Colbert asked, his tone measured but wary. Just providing some context for our discussion, Crockett replied, her voice steady as she unfolded a small piece of paper. Your team asked me to come on this show to discuss my work on voting rights legislation. But I've done my homework on The Late Show's political coverage over the past year. Colbert glanced toward his executive producer, who was now standing just off camera, her expression tense. Did you know, Crockett continued, that your show has spent more time mocking progressive policies than actually explaining them? Or that you've dedicated more airtime to silly games with celebrities than to discussing climate change legislation that will determine whether our planet remains habitable? The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light entertainment they had expected. We're a comedy show, Representative Crockett, Colbert countered, his voice taking on an edge. Our primary job is to entertain while informing. If you wanted a policy seminar, perhaps C-SPAN would be more your speed. That's convenient, isn't it? Crockett fired back. Hide behind comedy when challenged, but position yourself as a serious political commentator when it suits you. Your viewers deserve to know which one you actually are. Colbert leaned forward, dropping the pretense of casual banter. What exactly are you accusing me of? Because it sounds like you came here looking for a fight rather than a conversation. I came here expecting intellectual honesty from someone who claims to speak truth to power. Instead, I got condescension and lazy jokes about complex issues that affect real people. Colbert's patience visibly thinned. Let's address some of your political positions then, since you're so eager for substantive debate. Your stance on defunding police departments? There it is, Crockett interrupted, her voice rising. The deliberate misrepresentation. I've never advocated for defunding, but for reallocation of resources to address root causes of crime. But that nuance doesn't make for good punchlines, does it? What doesn't make for good television is a guest who refuses to let the host finish a sentence, Colbert shot back, his famous wit now weaponized. The control room was in chaos. The segment had already run 3 minutes over time, and producers were frantically signaling for a commercial break. Colbert ignored them, determined not to appear defeated. Your progressive tax proposals, he continued, his voice hardening, have been criticized by economists across the political spectrum as unrealistic. Even members of your own party have called them fantasy economics. Yet you present them as if they're obvious solutions with no downsides. Interesting how you can quote unnamed critics but can't engage with the actual policies, Crockett replied. Let me ask you something, Stephen. Have you actually read my economic proposals? Or do you just read the talking points your producers hand you? The audience gasped at the direct attack. Colbert's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. I prepare thoroughly for every interview, Representative. Perhaps instead of questioning my methods, you could explain why your wealth tax proposal ignores the capital flight we've seen in every country that's attempted similar measures. It doesn't ignore it. It addresses it specifically on page 8 of the legislation, which you would know if you'd read it, Crockett countered. But it's easier to mock than to understand, isn't it? Colbert abandoned all pretense of lightheartedness. You know what I find fascinating? Politicians who come on comedy shows and then complain about being treated like they're on a comedy show. And I find it fascinating how men like you hide behind comedy to avoid substantive criticism, Crockett fired back. The moment a black woman challenges you directly, suddenly it's, why so serious? The audience erupted into a mix of applause and uncomfortable murmuring. A producer stepped halfway onto the stage, signaling desperately for a break, but both Colbert and Crockett ignored her. Don't play the race card with me, Representative, Colbert said, his voice dropping dangerously low. My political views and my treatment of guests have nothing to do with race or gender. Don't they? Crockett asked, her voice icily calm. Because I have the data right here. She held up her paper again. Your show has interrupted female politicians 42% more often than their male counterparts over the past year. Black guests are given 37% less speaking time. Care to explain that pattern? The audience fell completely silent. Colbert stared at Crockett, momentarily speechless. Those statistics, he started, are from your own network's internal research, Crockett finished for him. Leaked by someone who's tired of the hypocrisy, someone who believed your public persona of progressivism and was disappointed by the reality. The executive producer was now fully on stage, standing just out of frame, mouthing "cut to commercial." Colbert's eyes darted toward her, then back to Crockett. This is absurd, he finally managed. You're making accusations based on cherry-picked data without context. Then provide the context, Stephen, Crockett challenged. Explain to your audience why you felt comfortable mocking my proposal for community investment programs as handouts last month, when you praised similar ideas from my white male colleague as innovative just 2 weeks earlier. The control room director finally took matters into his own hands, cutting to a commercial despite the host's objections. But before the cameras stopped rolling, Colbert made one final attempt to regain control. When we return, Representative Crockett and I will discuss her recent committee work, hopefully with fewer baseless accusations and more facts. Crockett leaned into her microphone as the studio lights began to dim for the break. The facts are precisely what I'm bringing to the table, Stephen. The question is whether you're ready to face them. As soon as the on-AR sign flickered off, the stage erupted into chaos. Production assistants rushed forward as Colbert ripped off his earpiece, his carefully constructed public persona completely shattered. "What the hell was that?" Colbert hissed at his executive producer, his face flushed with anger. "Did anyone vet her talking points?" The producer looked equally distressed. "She submitted completely different notes. This was clearly planned." Meanwhile, Crockett sat calmly in her chair, reviewing her notes as makeup artists descended on Colbert, dabbing at the beads of sweat that had formed on his forehead. "Representative," a nervous production assistant approached her, "we typically use the commercial break to discuss the direction for the next segment. The team was hoping I'd play nice after the break," Crockett finished. "For him. That's not happening. Either we continue this honest conversation, or I walk right now." Across the stage, Colbert was engaged in intense conversation with his head writer and executive producer. Their voices were hushed, but their gestures animated. Occasionally, Colbert would glance over at Crockett, his expression unreadable. The floor director began counting down. 30 seconds to air." The executive producer made a final appeal to Colbert, who shook his head firmly before straightening his tie and turning back toward his desk. The message was clear. He wasn't backing down either. "And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The floor director silently counted off the final 2 seconds. The on-air sign illuminated, and the cameras focused on Colbert's carefully composed smile. But even through the practiced facade, viewers could detect a new intensity in his eyes. "Welcome back to The Late Show. We're continuing our conversation with Representative Jasmine Crockett." His tone was noticeably cooler than before the break. "Representative, before the break, you made some serious allegations about this show's coverage. I think our viewers deserve more than just accusations. They deserve evidence." Crockett nodded. "I agree completely, Stephen. That's why I've arranged for these findings to be published online simultaneously with this interview. Viewers can check the data for themselves." She turned directly to the camera. "The link is available on my official social media accounts right now." Colbert's eyes widened slightly. She had outmaneuvered him again. The control room erupted as producers scrambled to verify her claim. "That's certainly thorough," Colbert managed, visibly recalculating his approach. "But raw data without context can be misleading. For instance, if certain guests speak less, perhaps it's because they have less to say, not because we're silencing them." "A convenient explanation," Crockett replied. "But the pattern is consistent across education levels, experience, and profession. The only consistent variables are race and gender." "Look," Colbert said, leaning forward, his tone hardening, "you came here under false pretenses. You presented yourself as willing to discuss policy, but clearly you had an agenda to attack this show and, frankly, to attack me personally." "I came prepared to discuss substance rather than submit to caricature," Crockett corrected. "But when you began mocking my policies rather than engaging with them, it confirmed everything I suspected about how this show operates." The audience was completely silent now, watching the intellectual duel unfold with unprecedented rawness for late-night television. "Since you seem determined to make accusations," Colbert countered, his patience visibly thinning, "let's address your own record. You've criticized my coverage of progressive policies, but you voted against progressive legislation when it didn't benefit your specific donors. Your righteous indignation seems conveniently selective." It was a direct hit. For the first time, Crockett appeared momentarily taken aback. The audience stirred, sensing the shift. "I voted against flawed bills that used progressive language to disguise corporate giveaways." She recovered quickly. "But nice attempt at deflection, Stephen. We were discussing your show's treatment of guests, not my voting record." "Oh, I think they're related," Colbert pressed his advantage. "You demand nuanced understanding of your positions while reducing mine to caricature. You call for evidence-based discussion while making sweeping claims about my motives. The hypocrisy is stunning. Is it hypocrisy to hold power accountable? Crockett fired back. You reach millions of viewers every night. Your framing shapes public perception. Yet when challenged, you retreat behind, "I'm just a comedian." Colbert's expression darkened. I've never retreated from anything. Night after night, I've used this platform to advocate for progressive values. For safe, progressive values, Crockett interrupted. For issues that don't threaten your wealthy sponsors or your comfortable viewers. When was the last time you challenged military spending, corporate monopolies, the pharmaceutical industry? You mock easy targets while the systems that create real oppression remain untouched. The tension in the studio was unbearable. Production assistants exchanged alarmed glances as Colbert's expression transformed into something his regular viewers had never seen before: raw, unfiltered anger. You don't know the first thing about what I believe or what I've sacrificed, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You come in here with your rehearsed takedown and your self-righteousness as if you're the only one fighting for change. The difference is, I have to build bridges while you just burn them for Twitter clips. And there it is, Crockett said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. The real Stephen Colbert. Not the progressive ally, but the establishment guardian. Who thinks challenging the status quo is just Twitter politics? She turned toward the audience. This is what happens when you push past the persona, folks. The mask slips. The audience gasped as Colbert stood up abruptly, his chair rolling. Backward? This interview is over, he declared. We'll be right back after— No, Crockett interrupted, standing as well. I think we're done here permanently. She reached for her microphone. But before I go, I want your audience to understand something. She addressed the stunned crowd, directly. Entertainment isn't innocent. The jokes you laugh at shape how you see the world. The questions that never get asked protect the powerful. Demand better from your media, even your comedy shows. With deliberate movements, she unclipped her microphone and placed it on the desk between them. Thank you for proving my point tonight, Stephen. The studio was absolutely silent as Crockett turned and walked off stage, her head held high. For several excruciating seconds, Colbert stood frozen behind his desk, the cameras still rolling, capturing a moment of genuine speechlessness from television's most articulate host. Finally, he sank back into his chair, adjusting his tie in a gesture that appeared more habit than necessity. We'll be right back, he managed, his voice hollow. As the show cut to commercial, social media was already exploding. Hashtags about the confrontation trended worldwide within minutes. Video. Clips spread across platforms with the speed of wildfire. Commentary ranged from outrage to admiration, split largely along ideological lines. By morning, the incident had transcended mere entertainment news to become a flashpoint in the national conversation about media, politics, and representation. Political analysts debated whether Crockett had committed career suicide or catapulted herself to a new level of influence. Media critics dissected every exchange, frame by frame. And in two separate parts of New York City, both Stephen Colbert and Jasmine Crockett faced sleepless nights, replaying the confrontation in their minds, wondering if they had gone too far, or not far enough, in defending their convictions on national television.